And to my dearest Mrs. Drake, I bequeath the entirety of my estate, Thornfield Hall.
It was you! You murdered him.
This confirms our suspicions, Lady Margaret. The symptoms match the poison.
And these receipts? The doctor's gambling debts?
The Housekeeper's conspiracy. The cold, damp November fog clung like a ghost to the walls of Thornfield Hall. Slanting raindrops lamented the panes of the high windows of the library, where the fire burned dimly. In contrast to the noise of the wind outside, there was a dead, oppressive silence within the hall. So silent that you could hear only two sounds, the heavy ticking of the great clock in the hall and the sound of Mrs. Eloise Drake's shoes as they clicked softly on the marble floor. Mrs. Drake stood in the main hall. She was dressed in her usual black, immaculate dress, and at her waist hung a bunch of keys that symbolized her authority. Her gray eyes, like a cold sea, surveyed everything. The gleam of the silverware, the absence of dust on the furniture, the silent movement of the servants. She was not the housekeeper of Thornfield Hall. She was its ruler. Suddenly, from the upper floor, that is, the west wing, came the sound of a faint cough. Lord Frederick Wentworth's room. Mrs. Drake paused for a moment. Her face was expressionless, but her fingers began to move restlessly over the bunch of keys. At that moment, from the opposite direction, Lady Margaret Wentworth, the Lord's young and beautiful wife, appeared laughing. She was dressed in silk and had a glass of champagne in her hand. "Mrs. Drake," she said carelessly, "what a gloomy evening. Can't music be played in this house?" Mrs. Drake looked at the lady, her eyes so cold that Lady Margaret's laughter froze in her throat. "The Lord is resting, madam," Mrs. Drake said in a low, steely voice, "and the doctor has ordered complete silence." Lady Margaret rolled her eyes and headed for her room. Mrs. Drake stood there, her eyes fixed on the corridor where Lord Frederick was struggling for life and death. A smile, almost imperceptible to her lips, spread, a secret known only to the walls of Thornfield Hall. The first thread of the conspiracy had been woven. By nightfall, the storm had broken over Thornfield Hall in full force. Rain was beating against the windows and lightning was crackling in the distance. It was a night when secrets were buried deep. The new maid, Eliza, entered Lord Frederick's room with trembling hands, carrying a tray of his nightly medicine. The room was cold and dark. The fire in the fireplace had almost died out. "Lord?" she called in a low voice. The figure on the bed was still. She set the tray on the bedside table and approached. "Lord, your medicine!" Just then, a flash of lightning struck, and for a moment the room was illuminated. Lord Frederick's eyes were fixed on the ceiling, open and lifeless. His hands were cold on his chest, and his face was agonized. Eliza's terrified scream echoed through the silent corridors of the hall. The first to arrive, as expected, was Mrs. Eloise Drake. She was dressed in a dressing gown, her hair neatly tied, as if she had just woken up and been waiting for this moment.
Charles!
"What's the noise?"
Oh my God,
she
Charles.
asked coldly, though she had already reached the door before Eliza's scream. She glanced at the bed. There was no expression of fear or shock on her face, only a pause. "The gentleman is dead," she announced calmly. At that moment, Lady Margaret entered the room panting, her face devoid of makeup and her eyes filled with panic. "Frederick? No, it can't be." She moved towards the bed crying, but her eyes were already surveying the valuables in the room. Mrs. Drake turned to Eliza, who was still standing there in shock. "What's wrong? Go tell Thomas, the footman, to call Dr. Barnes at once." As Thomas ran to make the call, he caught a glimpse of Mrs. Drake. She was picking up a glass of water from Lord's nightstand and wiping it carefully with her apron, as if wiping away evidence. In a moment, Dr. Barnes, who lived nearby, arrived, fighting the storm. He looked like a tired, troubled man. He examined Lord briefly, consoled Lady Margaret, and then went with Mrs. Drake into the library. "Heart attack," Dr. Barnes said, signing the death certificate. He had been in poor health for some time. Mrs. Drake nodded silently and handed the doctor a small, heavy envelope. "Your fee, doctor, and thank you for coming through this storm." A week had passed since Lord Frederick's funeral. There was a strange silence and tension in the library of Thornfield Hall. Outside, the merciless autumn wind was plucking the last leaves from the trees. Only a few people were in the room. Mr. Abernathy, the old family lawyer, was sitting at a table, polishing his spectacles. Before him lay the envelope containing Lord Frederick's last will. Lady Margaret, dressed from head to foot in expensive black mourning, was tapping her finger impatiently on the table. There was more anxiety than grief on her face. And in the corner, leaning against the wall, stood Mrs. Eloise Drake, silent. Her face was as expressionless as ever, as if she were not a part of the proceedings, but simply performing her duty. Thomas, the footman, had stopped to serve the syrup, and he watched everything in silence. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. "We are all saddened by the death of Lord Frederick. Now, in accordance with his last will, he mentioned a few trivial matters, some money to the butler, some to the old chauffeur." Lady Margaret sighed pitifully.
Fraud.
"And now," said the lawyer, his eyes fixed on the paper, "the estate of Thornfield Hall, the London flat, and all the remaining wealth of the Wentworth family."
Murder.
Lady Margaret sat up straight, a triumphant smile on her face.
Fraud.
"I give it, with all my soundness of mind," the lawyer continued, "to my faithful, trusted, and 30-year-old companion, Mrs. Eloise Drake." A deathly silence filled the room. The tray had almost fallen from Thomas's hand. Lady Margaret's face went white first, then red with rage. "What?" she cried. "It's impossible. It's a fraud. This maid has deceived my husband. She must have forced him." Mr. Abernathy took off his glasses. "Lady Wentworth, the will is clearly signed by the Lord, and there are 2 witnesses. It's legal." "I don't believe it." Lady Margaret stood up, banging her fist on the table. "This woman has killed my husband. I say she has murdered him." All eyes were fixed on Mrs. Drake. She came out of the corner. Her face still had the same cold calm. She looked at Lady Margaret, and for the first time a faint glint of triumph appeared in her eyes. "Madam," Mrs. Drake said in her low, steely voice, "you are now a guest in this house. Please keep your voice low." Lady Margaret, now deprived of both her wealth and her home, stormed out of the room trembling with rage. Thomas stood there, everything clear in his mind. The envelope given to the doctor, the cleaned glass, and now this will. It was all connected. It was a conspiracy, a housekeeper's complete, cold, and successful conspiracy. Nobody slept that night at Thornfield Hall. Lady Margaret was breaking things in her room, and the servants were cowering in their quarters. Thomas, the footman, paced restlessly in his little room. He could not forget Mrs. Drake's calm face, Dr. Barnes' frightened manner, and Lord Frederick's wide eyes. He knew that what had happened was not a natural death. That glass! Why had they cleaned that glass? About midnight, when the whole house was silent, Thomas made a decision. He crept out of his room and headed for the west wing, where Lord Frederick's room was. As he had suspected, the door was locked from the outside. It was Mrs. Drake's order. But Thomas knew the old ways of the servants. He went through the service corridor, up a small staircase that opened directly into the Lord's dressing room. The room was cold and deserted. The furniture looked ghostly in the moonlight. Thomas went straight to the nightstand. He opened the drawer where Eliza had kept the medicine bottle. It was there, labeled sleep pill. But Thomas was looking for something else. He felt the rug under the bedside table. Nothing. Then he peered under the bed. There, hidden in the darkness, lay a small, dark brown bottle. It had no label. He opened the lid and sniffed it. There was a strange, bitter smell that he didn't recognize, but it was strong. He put the bottle carefully in his pocket. He was about to turn when he heard the key turn in the lock on the main door. Thomas quickly hid behind the curtains, his heart pounding. The door opened, and Mrs. Drake entered. They did not light a candle, but walked by the moonlight as if accustomed to seeing in the dark. She went straight to the fireplace. Bending down, she removed a loose brick from between the bricks. Behind it was a small gap. She reached into the gap and pulled out a small leather box. She opened it, comforted it, and put it back. Then she turned and went straight to the nightstand where Thomas had just searched. She opened the drawer, looked at the medicine bottle, and then leaned under the bed. Thomas looked through the crack in the curtain. Mrs. Drake's face was shining in the moonlight. She was staring at the spot from which Thomas had picked up the nameless bottle. For a moment, she was perfectly still, and then she stood up slowly. She knew that the bottle was not there. She glanced quickly around the room, her eyes piercing the darkness. Thomas held his breath. "Whoever is here," Mrs. Drake said in a cool, whispery voice, "is playing a game he can't win." She turned, left the room, and locked the door again. Thomas stepped out from behind the curtains, trembling. The vial in his pocket was no longer just evidence. It was a deadly secret. Thomas knew that he could not face Mrs. Drake alone. The local doctor himself was part of the conspiracy. He had only one ally left, no matter how unwelcome, Lady Margaret. He plucked up the courage to go to Lady Margaret, who was drinking in her room and bemoaning her fate. "Madam," Thomas said quickly, "I know you think the will is a forgery, but the truth is far more terrible." He placed the small, unmarked vial on the table in front of her. It was under the Lord's bed. Lady Margaret looked at the vial. She was greedy, but not foolish. She realized at once that this was her last hope.
This
If she could
confirms our
prove murder,
suspicions, Lady
the
Margaret.
will would
The
automatically
symptoms
be
match the
revoked.
poison.
And these
"What do you
receipts?
want?" she asked.
The doctor's gambling
"I only
debts?
want the truth," Thomas replied. "And I want you to call Scotland Yard in London, not the local police." 2 days later, Inspector Fielding, a sharp and serious officer of Scotland Yard, arrived at Thornfield Hall in the fog. They were brought into the library, the very place where the will had been read. Mrs. Drake, Lady Margaret, and Thomas were all present. "Mrs. Drake," said the inspector, opening his little notebook, "I have a complaint from Lady Wentworth that you forced Lord Frederick to change the will." "That is a lie," Mrs. Drake replied calmly. "The Lord gave me everything of his own free will." "No," Thomas interrupted, his voice trembling but confident. "They didn't give you everything, Mrs. Drake. You took it all from them." Thomas held the vial out to the inspector. "I found this vial in my lord's room, and last night I searched Mrs. Drake's room when she was in the garden." Mrs. Drake's eyes flashed with anger for the first time. Thomas picked up an old, faded photograph frame from above the fireplace. It showed 2 young girls smiling. One was Eloise Drake, the current housekeeper, and the other was a little girl who looked exactly like her. "That's your sister, isn't it? Anna Drake. She was a maid in this very hall 20 years ago." Lady Margaret's complexion turned pale. "I checked the old village records," Thomas said to the inspector. "Anna Drake was fired for theft. The charge was that she had stolen a valuable necklace belonging to Lady Margaret, who was then a newlywed bride." Mrs. Drake stood silent, as if she were a stone statue. Anna was so humiliated that she committed suicide by jumping into a nearby river a week after she was fired. Thomas handed the inspector another piece of paper. "And these are receipts for Dr. Barnes' gambling debts, which have been paid off by an anonymous person for the past 6 months." The room fell into complete silence. The end. Inspector Fielding looked at Mrs. Drake. Mrs. Drake? The housekeeper took a long, cold breath. When he raised his head, 30 years of hatred burned in his eyes, and his target was not the inspector, but Lady Margaret. "That necklace," said Mrs. Drake in a venomous whisper, "she gave it to Anna herself. My sister had seen her in questionable circumstances with one of the Lord's friends. Lady Margaret gave it to my sister to silence her, and when the Lord asked about the necklace, he put the whole blame on my innocent sister." Lady Margaret cried out, "Lies! It's all lies!" "I waited 30 years," said Mrs. Drake, ignoring her. "I was in this house. I served him. I won his confidence. I saw this woman debauchery on the Lord's money, while my sister lay in a cold grave. His face was no longer calm, but burning with the fire of revenge. When the Lord fell ill, I began my game. I paid off Dr. Barnes' debts. I began to give the Lord the medicine, poison, that Thomas had received. Little by little, I changed his will, made him believe that his wife was just waiting for him to die. Which was true. I took everything from him," Mrs. Drake pointed to the trembling Lady Margaret. "His house, his money, his honor, just as he took it from my sister." Inspector Fielding stepped forward and put his hand on Mrs. Drake's shoulder. "Aloysia Drake, I arrest you for the murder of Lord Frederick Wentworth and for conspiring with Dr. Barnes." Mrs. Drake made no resistance.